Welcome to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We bring together the latest research in linguistics, language acquisition, and biblical studies to better understand the biblical languages and ultimately the biblical text. As always, this episode is brought to you by Biblingo, the premier solution for learning, maintaining, and enjoying the biblical languages. Visit biblingo.org to learn more and start your 10-day free trial.
This is your host, Kevin Grosso, and I'm excited to talk with Dr. Esther Chazon today about the Dead Sea Scrolls. Welcome to the show, Esther.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
So just a personal anecdote about Esther. She was actually my teacher at Hebrew University. I took I think 2 classes with her, one on the Dead Sea Scrolls and one on apocalyptic literature. And so she knows a ton about both. But today we're going to talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls. And of course, there is apocalyptic literature in the Dead Sea Scrolls. But can you just start out by introducing yourself? Why should I be talking to you about the Dead Sea Scrolls other than you being my former teacher? You were previously, I think, the director of the Orion Institute. So maybe you can tell us about that and your role at Hebrew U.
Okay. So yes, I'm professor, just recently retired, but still very active at Hebrew University, officially in the Hebrew literature department, but I really also taught in the Bible department and in comparative religion department as well. And I directed, we were the first institute for the study of Dead Sea Scrolls. We set it up in 1995. I first was associate director under my professor, Michael Stone, and then I directed the institute for 20 years, really until the year before I retired. And then I handed over the reins, but I'm still on the academic committee. And I'm on a few international committees. Also, there's an international organization for Qumran Studies, and a very important organization. I'm on the steering committee. So I may be recently retired, but I'm still very active.
Still having fun, right?
I'm still having fun. Yeah, I'm still research and writing, and Dead Sea Scrolls is my main area of research. Of course, we do more than that, but that's really my main focal point.
Yeah, that's fantastic. So can you just start out by telling us, for the complete novice, what are the Dead Sea Scrolls? Why are they significant both for our understanding of the Bible and for Second Temple Judaism in general?
Okay, well, the name is a giveaway, right? Because the Dead Sea Scrolls were found along the western shore of the Dead Sea. There are about 1,500 scrolls. We take into account all of the sites. I'll be mainly talking about Qumran, but there's also Masada and Nahal Hever, and there are other sites a little bit further south than Qumran. At Qumran alone, we have about 930 scrolls, which is quite a bit. And I think the time frame is important. The scrolls from Qumran, the earliest scrolls we have, which are actually biblical scrolls, and also some of the Apocrypha, the books that didn't make it into the Hebrew Bible, but some of them made it into the Greek Bible. The ones that didn't make it into the Greek Bible or the Vulgate, the Latin Bible, made it into Coptic, Ethiopic, and Syriac, etc., Armenian. So the earliest scrolls we have are from the 3rd century BCE, and they go right up until the Jewish revolt against Rome. The site was destroyed in 68 CE. The scrolls from the other sites are mainly from the period of the Second Jewish Revolt, the Bar Kokhba Revolt, which was in the early 2nd century CE and was very, very catastrophic. And then we're really into the beginning of both the rabbinic period and also the early Christian period. So that's the date range of the scrolls. And I would say probably the most important thing is that we had no texts in Hebrew or Aramaic between the Bible and the first rabbinic text, the Mishnah, at about 200 CE. You know, we had some inscriptions and so forth, but we had no texts. We had no literature. And so there was a tremendous gap in our knowledge. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, you can just imagine 1,500 scrolls, 930 just in Qumran, really fill that gap. That's key significance. Yeah. At a crucial period, right? Just the turn of the millennium, the beginning of Christianity, the beginning of rabbinic Judaism, which then took some time, but then became like Judaism for all ages. So, yeah.
And I think one thing to keep in mind too is that these were discovered only in 1948, which was, in history yesterday, right?
Right.
And so it is still shaping our understanding of that time period. Whereas, and even before that, we just didn't have, like you said, we didn't have anything between the Bible and the Mishnah. And for that gap to be filled by something in Hebrew and Aramaic is pretty incredible. So you keep mentioning this community at Qumran. Can you tell people again who, let's say they've never been to Israel, because some people who are listening to this might not have been to Israel, but if you haven't been, you should go. But if you haven't been, what is Qumran? And what is the connection between Qumran and the scrolls?
Okay, so first, to just give a sense of the geography, we go by car today. It's, only about a half an hour from Jerusalem, but they say approximately a half a day journey by mule from the old city, let's say, down to Qumran and down to the Dead Sea. It's kind of like being in Utah and Salt Lake, because it is a salt lake and it's very low. But so that's where it is, on the edges of the Dead Sea, and the connection between the site and the scrolls. So the scrolls were found in the caves around Qumran. And in fact, the largest cave, Cave 4, the only way to get there is through the site, unless you want to scale up the riverbed onto the mountain where the cave is. But so that's the only place, and that's very important. And some of the other caves also are only accessible through the site itself. So there's actually a physical connection between the caves where the scrolls were found and this settlement that was unearthed at this place called Qumran. That's the name of the wadi, of the riverbed, which is dry in the summer and sometimes has flash floods in the winter. So that's in terms of the location, and also the connection, the proximity of the scrolls caves, we call them 11 scrolls caves, to the site. And there is also correspondence between some of the scrolls, what the scrolls are describing in terms of the life of the community, a communal life, a lot of emphasis on purity, ritual baths, and what is found at the site, that there are communal facilities for dining, for example, with a large pantry connected to the dining room, and as I said, a lot of ritual baths and very extensive water systems. So the archaeology and the texts really work together, and we talk about the scrolls that were found in the caves of Qumran as the library of the group that lived at the Qumran. And I'm going to refer to them as the Yachad. That's the name they gave themselves, means in Hebrew, together, coming together. And that's because they had a communal lifestyle, shared property, shared food, shared work, and so forth.
So can you speak to the relationship between this group and the Essenes? So like some people might have heard of the Essenes. In scrolls literature, you get different names for this group, like the Dead Sea sect too, right? They're called a sect sometimes. And you call them, I think, the sectarians. What do these terms mean? Is there a consensus on them being equivalent to the Essenes or like part of them? What is their relationship to the sects that we know of? Like Josephus mentions the sects of the Pharisees, Sadducees, and Essenes. So are we to group them into one of those buckets, or are they a separate thing altogether?
Okay, so I'm gonna.
I know that's a big question, right? But
it's it's an important question, and I think a lot of people pick up a book on the scrolls. I don't want to say what percentage, but a large percentage of the books written about the scrolls, both academic and popular, will make the connection between the Essenes and the group that lived at Qumran. However, as you mentioned, and I want to reiterate this, that the name Essenes only appears in outside sources, in Josephus, in Philo, in Pliny, and so forth. And so they don't call themselves the Essenes. And I would say, if they are the same group, and I had to grade Josephus's description, don't forget he's writing after, well, he lived in Israel until the destruction of the Second Temple, then he moved to Rome. But I wouldn't give him more than a 90 if he was trying to group, maybe an 85, because this was not the only communal group, right, in these times. And so there were other communal groups as well. And rabbinic literature doesn't mention the Essenes. It does mention the Pharisees and the Sadducees, for example. So it's the closest match, but I don't like to say Essenes are this group at Qumran because I don't feel that there's enough of an identity between the Yachad at Qumran, that's what they call themselves, and the Essenes. There are differences in Josephus's description from this group in terms of, for example, now they are a sect, right? They separated and you had to be admitted, and it was a 2-year process. And for example, Josephus talks about a 3-year process. So that's one difference right there.
So basically, we have this text from Josephus, and really, Josephus could, to your point, just be wrong, right, about, some of the details. He could have just gotten an 85, right, and just messed up on the last 15%. Or he could have been describing a group that was broader. Just, there's different options. But just to point out, I people often will make this sort of equation of Dead Sea group and Essenes. So yeah, if you are reading the literature, you should be aware of that it's not a given that those two are the same group. So you mentioned that the earliest biblical text found was 3rd century BCE, but there's also other texts. So basically what I want to do is get into some of the issues with the biblical text and then also the non-biblical text, which I know you and honestly me personally also find more interesting, just because the Bible we had that before, right? It wasn't it wasn't new. I mean, it was kind of new. I mean, there are important things, right? It feels wrong to say that the Bible was less important, but so tell us about the biblical text. How was the discovery of the biblical manuscripts at Qumran changed our perspective on the textual history of the Bible? And maybe you can compare the manuscripts from Qumran to, the second earliest manuscripts we have as well that we would have in our Bibles.
Okay. So the first point I want to make is really a more general, and that is when we think about the library at Qumran, it's really important to remember that we have 200 copies, scrolls of biblical books. I mean, there are 24 biblical books, but we have many, many copies. We have 36 copies just of Psalms and 30 copies of Deuteronomy and Isaiah. Those are the most popular 21. But that's really important to remember, not only for the textual history of the Bible, but what the scrolls give us, because they really teach us about a wide range of Jewish literature and Jewish groups and Jewish traditions in the Second Temple period, and not just a small sect that lived at Qumran and maybe a few other places. And that's really, really important. This was a very, very strict religious group, and they took with them, when they went to Qumran, they took with them a lot of biblical literature. Now, they didn't hold a Bible like we do today. Everything is in scrolls. And you don't get all 5 books of the Torah in one scroll, but you do get sometimes 2. Genesis and Exodus, we have Exodus, Leviticus and Numbers. Only Deuteronomy is never with another scroll. So that's really, really important. And I'm going to get back to the Bibles in 1 minute, but I want to say that just like they took with them biblical scrolls, they also took with them a whole host of Jewish literature that we didn't know existed. We only know some of it existed because it was preserved by mainly Oriental churches, but also in the Septuagint and the Greek Bible. That's the stuff that we were interested in, right? The apocalyptic literature, the visions, the predictions of the days to come, the biblical interpretation, prayers. We'll get into that later. Now, in terms of the Bible, we had very little until the medieval period. We had quotations of the Bible of course, in the New Testament and rabbinic literature, but we had no copies of the Bible until about the 4th century CE. So this is really explosive. And we used to think that there was the Masoretic text. That's what's made it into most of our Bibles. Even English translations now, like the Revised Standard Version and so forth, will essentially translate the Masoretic text, right? We knew there was a Greek Bible that had some minor differences from the Masoretic text and also some extra books, like the books of Maccabees and Ben Sira. we knew that. And we knew more recently that the Samaritans, another group, I don't know if I would call them a sect, but you could call them a sect, or you could call them a certain wing of Judaism. They also had a Bible. So at the very beginning, as you mentioned, in the 1950s and 60s, well, I think even into the 70s, they were talking about, well, there were three traditions. There's the Masoretic, the Greek Bible, and for the Greek-speaking world, particularly in Egypt, and the Samaritan, Pentateuch. And really, this has become certainly more complex, and there's much more plurality than we ever thought, because in Qumran, just in this one library, we have biblical texts that are like the Masoretic texts. We have some biblical texts that are like the Septuagint, the Greek Bible. We even have some Greek texts, right? Just a few. And also we have some that are expansive, like the Samaritan Pentateuch. And we have some that are what we call non-aligned, that they don't match up one-to-one to either one of those. And that tells us that really there were more versions of the Bible. And the fact that the same group was able to have biblical texts like the Samaritan Pentateuch, like the Greek Bible, like the Masoretic text, and texts that represent all three types, or even none of them, shows us that although there was great reverence for the Bible, a certain authoritative status, we can tell that by how it's used and the number of copies and how they were copied. But the actual form of the Bible, or the actual specific wording and the lettering, was not considered, let's say, sacred. Or I would put it the other way, any form of the Bible was considered authoritative. Okay?
Yeah, that's interesting. So could that be also partly influenced because they were, just by virtue of them being scribes, so like they were just copying things? If you have the Samaritan Pentateuch and the Proto-MT, are you just like okay with the discrepancies? Like are they doing like textual analysis of like which one is, I mean, it doesn't seem like they were, like which one is earlier, which one is original, like I don't know. I guess, can you speak to how they might have viewed those differences? Do we know anything about that?
I think the number of copies that there are speaks to the fact that they were able to use all the different versions, and they didn't have the sense of, if you spelled it one way or you spelled it the other way. That's the most I can really surmise from that there was a reverence and authoritative status for the biblical books, but we would revere and we would hold as important, as authoritative, any good copy. And the good copy could be any one of these streams. And it's also possible they used it for study purposes, because this group studied 1/3 of every night together. They had scriptural study, interpretation, and so forth. But you mentioned the scribes, because the other thing that we see that there was more scribal freedom. The scribes were an elite group, and we can see scribal activity. You can see this in medieval biblical manuscripts as well, where there's certain like notations of a difficult word, or maybe it's spelled wrong, and these kind of make their way into the body of the text at some point. I mean, in the Hebrew Bible, you have plenty of examples of places where a word is read one way and it's pronounced for the liturgical reading another way. These are later traces of the same phenomenon.
Right. So last question on the biblical text, and then we'll get to the, let's say, equally as fun non-biblical texts. So are the Dead Sea Scrolls, so they obviously would predate any of the other Hebrew texts we have, right? Just by virtue of them being earlier, all of them. Does that make them more reliable? I mean, obviously what you just said was there's different versions in the Dead Sea Scrolls themselves. So how do we think through discrepancies? And can you give us an example of one between the Dead Sea Scrolls and the MT that we have?
Yeah, I can give you some examples. I mean, I think, our tendency is to say what's older is closer to the original, but sometimes a careful scribal tradition, even if it comes down to us later, can better preserve something that we think might be an original reading. That can happen. I'll give you an example, one that will, let's say, favor perhaps the older text. In our Masoretic text, in Psalm 145, which is an alphabetic acrostic, there's one letter of the acrostic that's missing. It's the nun letter, like practically right in the middle. And it seems very, very strange that it should be missing. I mean, no one has come up, let's say, with a theological reason why this letter should be missing, And both in the Septuagint and in one of the Psalm scrolls, the big Psalm scroll from Cave 11, a verse is added in. So I just brushed up on this a bit today. I haven't seen that anybody says, well, this was the original verse. Maybe they did, but I missed it. But rather, there was a sense that this was lacking. Maybe there was an original verse and it fell out. Things fall out, and the doublets creep in and other things fall out. And whoever was putting together the Psalm scroll from Qumran or translating the Psalm into Greek noticed, as anybody else would, that there's a letter missing, and so they filled in the blank. So that's one example where the earlier text that we have represented by the Masoretic text may not be the oldest. In other words, what came down to us is missing a verse. The original probably had a verse that we no longer have. The other example that we spoke about that's really glaring, and if you go to the Shrine of the Book, where the Israeli Antiquities Authorities, where they have scrolls, they really love to show this copy of Deuteronomy, which is harmonistic. And they did, and this is talk about exegesis, but that's an interpretive tool. We have the 10 Commandments in Exodus, we have the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy. The topics are the same, the laws are the same, but for example, in the Shabbat commandment, one reason is given in Exodus because God created the seventh day. Another reason is given in Deuteronomy because remember the Sabbath day because you were slaves in Egypt. And what Deuteronomy N does, and it's not the only text that does this, so does the Samaritan Pentateuch, which also tends to be harmonistic, is it puts in Deuteronomy, it adds in the reason that's given in Exodus. So
the more logical reason, right? I mean, like,
yeah, a more logical reason, but it doesn't take out what's in Deuteronomy. So, but the harmonizing, it's an interpretive move, but it's made actually by the scribe in this particular case.
Right.
So
right.
That's interesting. So this is, later than what we have in our Masoretic text, clearly. Yeah.
Right. So when if you're reading the Bible in English, which, some people still do, just kidding. We encourage everyone to read it in the original Hebrew. But even if you are, you would see sometimes a footnote that says Dead Sea Scrolls have something different, right? Dead Sea Scrolls have this reading. So the things to consider are, one, it is earlier, right? That's significant.
Physically, it's earlier for sure.
Right,
yeah.
Right. But two, it could be them harmonizing. And three, there are just a variety of manuscripts in general in the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? And they might just be copying. It doesn't even mean that they would think that this is the, quote unquote, better or earlier text, but just that was the text that they had, right? That's a text that they had and it was earlier.
Or it could just be in some cases, it's just that the scribe said a particular word it doesn't make sense. It's too difficult to understand, or this must be, a mistake. And the scribe will go ahead and change it. Or sometimes the scribe will add and not just change. And in this case, it's something that's added in. It's clearly an interpretive move.
Right.
You're reading Deuteronomy, be aware that in Exodus, you also have the 10 Commandments, but it's giving another reason. So I'm now, as the scribe of Deuteronomy, going to give you both.
Right.
And the scribe knows perfectly well that the other reason's in Exodus, right?
Well, and it actually might, if you are an ancient Jew listening to this text in Deuteronomy, when's the next time you get to listen to it in Exodus, right? Like if you can't read, right? And I mean, some of them certainly could read, but some of them couldn't. And if you're hearing this text, right, it might just be useful to hear the reason from Exodus as well, right? And when you're hearing Deuteronomy, or reading it, right? Because you don't just get to flip through your Bible or change the verse on your iPhone from Exodus to Deuteronomy and read it in parallel, right? I mean,
Right.
that's
Right. You don't do the split screen on your computer.
right. To see all the differences. All right, very good. So non-biblical texts. First of all, what categories of text? I mean, these people obviously were engrossed in the Bible, right? So a lot of these texts are related to the Bible, but they're not the Bible themselves. So what categories of texts do we have at Qumran that are related to the biblical text, but not the Bible themselves? Or you can just talk about also just the sectarian texts at Qumran.
Okay, well, those are two really different topics.
Okay,
right?
so give us a brief picture of each.
Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to begin. I'm going to say that really I'll talk about the different types of texts that are related to the Bible. In each category, there are examples both from strictly sectarian texts and also from non-sectarian texts, and hopefully I'll make that clear. And I'm going to start. The clearest example is the commentaries that we're most familiar with from the late Roman Byzantine period up until the present day. When you open a Bible with a commentary, it's going to have the quotation of the biblical verse or part of the biblical verse, and then there'll be an explanation. And it'll be and often it'll be marked off, like there'll be in bold will be the part that's in the Bible, and then there'll be a comment in regular type. So we do have that. We don't have too many commentaries that were not from Qumran, but we have a few. And then the sect itself developed. We talked about their messianic aspirations, end of days, and so forth. They developed a unique type of commentary called the Pesher, in which they laid claim to divine revelation themselves. And they took each of the prophets and included in this the Psalms because David was considered a prophet. And they would take a verse, doesn't matter, from Nahum or from Habakkuk or from the Psalms or Isaiah. And this is what the prophet said, give you the quote, and then they'll give you the meaning that was revealed to them about their own times, because the prophets prophesied for their own days, only a little bit for the future, but mainly is a lot of politics, both internal and external, and what's going to happen and how people have to behave. So they would say, okay, Isaiah prophesied about the eve of the destruction of the first temple and going into exile and so forth. But the deeper meaning, the second layer, the hidden meaning that's been revealed to us is about our time, end time, and so forth. And that's a unique type of commentary that they developed. But we do, as I say, have the other type as well. This was something that we had absolutely no idea about. No idea that this existed before the early rabbinic and early Christian commentaries. That's one category. An even earlier means of interpreting the Bible is called rewritten Bible. And we have many, many, many works of rewritten Bible. And in those works, almost all of these are non-sectarian. I can't at the moment think of anything that is sectarian. They're older. The interpretation is actually woven into the verse. And so if you don't know the Bible really well, you might actually think that the interpretation was part of the text. For example, I'll give you an example, right? When Abraham and Sarah go down to Egypt because there's a famine in Egypt, right after they get to the land, and then there's a famine and they go down to Egypt. Sarah doesn't speak, there's no conversation. And when you read the Genesis Apocryphon or you read the Book of Jubilees, there's a lot more conversation going on there. And that's just one example, and that happens all of the time. So that's the category of rewritten Bible. We have tens and tens, scores and scores of documents like that. The most famous really are the Genesis Apocryphon, the Book of Jubilees, the Testament genre I also count. Like you have the last Testament of Moses, the last Testament of Jacob, and so forth. And this becomes in a genre. And there is also rewritten Bible in that genre.
Would you include the temporal scroll?
I was just going to mention the Temple Scroll.
Because I would, you know, feel like it is, and also that it would, and I know there's debate too on whether it's sectarian or not.
I don't think
So,
it's sectarian.
okay.
I just think that some of the laws and certainly the calendar are the same. But yes, the Temple Scroll is the one example that we have of a legal work, and it's God is the speaker. In the other works, like Moses is being spoken to by the angel of presence and jubilees, and then he speaks, right? And the Genesis Apocryphon, whoever is the star of that particular passage is speaking. So it could be Enoch, and then it goes to Noah, and then it goes to Abraham, and Lot speaks, and so forth. So yes, and they hang this really on ancient figures, and the Temple Scroll is an example of that. And it's also harmonistic,
Mm-hmm.
right? It'll go through if it's talking about a law in Deuteronomy and there's a parallel in either Exodus or Leviticus, it's going to harmonize it and make it into an intelligible law. So that's, yes, I was going to include the Temple Scroll, and I were also going to include our apocalypses in a way, because a lot of them are like the Book of Enoch, a rewritten Bible, rewriting the story. The angels who came down rebelled and took women in Genesis 6, and then they had these hybrid children, and that's how evil entered the world. I mean, that's an apocalypse because it's revealed to Enoch and he's telling the story. But it is also rewritten Bible, just as Jubilees is, right? Because it's a revelation to Moses before the things actually transpire. And then I just want to mention two other phenomena that really continue with us until the present day. And one is to use quotations, the quotations from the Bible as proof text. You know, if your preacher or your rabbi or your priest or your minister is going to give a sermon, they're going to want to weave into that sermon some biblical texts, right? And we have this in Qumran, not only in the rewritten Bible, but also used as proof text in legal texts, and you have that in rabbinic literature as well. And then you also have what I would call inadvertent or implied exegesis. If you're imbued with the Bible, and this is true in modern songs, it's true in American film and American theater. Shawshank Redemption, is a great example. So, redemption is in, and the key is in the Bible, and when he opens it up at the end. And so there is, whether it's intentional or not, there is exegetical interpretive activity going on there, and phrases, expressions, concepts of the Bible are being used for other purposes, whether they be homilies, whether they be wisdom teachings, whether they be psalms or prayers. So there's also interpretation there. And even there, we can see sometimes, I've seen this in my own work, that wait a minute, this text doesn't align with the MT, it doesn't align with Septuagint. It's just, I have a few examples of non-aligned texts that apparently are being used in Psalms and prayers also.
Yeah. So all of those texts then are basically texts that are taking the Bible and doing something with it, right?
Exactly.
And so we don't have to touch on the other texts, the sectarian texts. You can go read those for yourself. They're very interesting, the community rule, things like that. So those are texts about the community at Qumran, for example, talking about all kinds of different things, their practices, how to join the group, and et cetera, et cetera.
But they also use proof texts, like the verse in Isaiah, called to go out.
The one crying out in the wilderness. Yes.
In the New Testament, right? They also use that. And when they have their own laws of reproach, they'll quote the biblical passages right in their own community rules. So that's also a very good example.
Yeah. Yeah. So you have specifically worked a lot on hymns and prayers in the Dead Sea Scrolls. So I want to give you the chance to help us understand at a deeper level, how do you actually work through a text and decide, okay, what's going on here in terms of their exegesis, just for us to get a feel for how they were weaving together the Bible into these compositions and how they were using the Bible to either interpret itself or just as a part of a larger text. So you had an article, I can't remember exactly what the title of it now was, but we can put a link in the description. And you were talking about the Hodayot, right? Thanksgiving hymns.
Thanksgiving.
Yes, sorry. The Hodayot. In this text, it is a list of these hymns, right, to God. And you have this text in 827. So this seems like it is it is, I mean, you point this out, that it is this meshing of Daniel 9:7 and Jeremiah 14:22. Daniel 9:7 says, Lacha Adonai Hatzaka Velanu Boshet Hapanim Kayom Hazeh, and Jeremiah 14:22, Ki ata asita et kol ele. So basically, what you tell us, what's going on here? Why did the author do this, and what's the significance of combining the quote and this slight change in language?
Okay. So, I mean, I didn't interview the author of this text the way you're interviewing me, but I have to.
Wouldn't that have been nice, though?
I have to reverse engineer it, right? So, that I want to reiterate, these are sectarian texts, the Hodayot. In a minute, I'll say that the techniques are the same techniques that we have in non-sectarian poetry, the same techniques that we have in the Book of Psalms and Chronicles, when it rewrites, combines different psalms into a new psalm, or it takes a psalm, Solomon's prayer or David's prayer, and kind of reworks it. So the technique is similar. It's a blended quotation, as you said. It puts together a phrase. The first part of the phrase seems to come from Daniel 9:7. The second part of the phrase seems to come, and I'll explain why I'm saying seems to come, from Jeremiah 14:22, because I'm not sure the author of the Thanksgiving hymn actually put them together. I think he's using a blended quotation. This is a formula for what we call the acceptance of divine judgment, right? If bad things happen to you and you want to recognize that it comes from God, it's a very typical formula. It appears also in the liturgy for the Day of Atonement and so forth, in the penitential liturgy. So this is an important point, because I don't think he's doing it. He's capable of doing it. I'm sure he does this blending quotation business, often. But this particular case, I don't think so, because I have almost the identical wording in the words of the luminaries, which is non-sectarian, which is written at the beginning of the 2nd century BCE. So he might be getting it from there, but I think it's just out there. And there are other cases in that article, another article like that I wrote, where I saw that the author of these Thanksgiving hymns is very, very sophisticated poetry on every level, from the point of view of the metaphors and the use of the Bible, and it's just the language. It's a very high register of the language. So he's also using traditional blessing formula, and he's also using the divine attribute formula that we get in Exodus and the revelation of God, of his attributes to Moses, that then gets reused in Moses's prayer in the incident of the 12 spies. So he's using, it was called Tradition and Innovation, I think, that article, because he's using, just like he uses the Bible, he's using what he has in the way of previous prayers, previous exemplars that are around, and he's using them to create new poetry. And as I said, this is a technique that's going on right to our day. So I always will I'll work through, of course, with a concordance and so forth, and various dictionaries to understand what's happening in the text, and then what he's using and how he's getting there. So I say it's interesting because both the sectarian author, the teacher, the maskil, the sage who's writing these Thanksgiving hymns, is using formula not only from the Bible, but from other Jewish sources at the time, that we now have some of them. Of course, he's giving his own theology, his own interpretation, but he's using the material. He's using the same techniques, and this is also true of the legal interpretation. They're using the same techniques, the same hermeneutical techniques and literary techniques as other scribes and other authors are using. The implications for Jewish liturgy, and this is what I'm going to say, also holds for the whole field of law, the development of Jewish law from the Bible. How do we get to rabbinic law? It was a complete blank. There were even theories that the rabbis completely innovated, the legal system after the destruction of the temple. that there was no public prayer during the Second Temple period because we worshiped God through sacrifices at the temple. There was a whole theory like that, and there were no prayers that were preserved, and there was no codices of Jewish law that we had before the scrolls. So now all of a sudden we have this phenomenon of Jewish prayer, not just individual prayer, but also of communal prayer, and not just in sectarian circles. So this is a tremendous boon. So we can see the differences, but we also see the commonalities, the common sources, common traditions, common ways of interpreting the hermeneutics, ways of interpreting the Bible. And I guess it shouldn't so much surprise us because some of them are in common with the hermeneutics of the Hellenistic tradition, how Homer was interpreted, how Plato was interpreted, how Aristotle interpreted some basic logic and literary techniques.
Yeah, that's super interesting. I mean, this is kind of off the cuff. Do you think that the Qumran sectarians, to what extent do you think that they were influenced by Greek thought?
I think you can see some traces of Greek thought, and I think you can see traces, in the aspects of dualism, so forth, of the Persian. How it was channeled to them, I don't know. The fact that there is one cave, Cave 7, that had Greek texts in it, who obviously there was a Greek expert scribe who worked in that. So you could easily see how at least some of the scribes and also some of the elite, don't forget, this is a very elite community, right? They study together every night. They pride themselves in that study and having the interpretations revealed. I think that some actually probably had direct influence, and others, I think it just was channeled, the book of Ben Sira, which is so far from their thought, or the biblical book of Ecclesiastes. I mean, it's imbued with Greek thought. So I think it was channeled in different ways, mainly indirectly, but perhaps even by some Greek experts among the members of the sect.
Yeah, that's great. So super interesting. Can you just, to wrap things up, give us one or two big issues that are being worked on in the scrolls literature right now for the scholars out there? Like, what are the Dead Sea scholars either finding out or really interested in, or, what are the big things in the field right now that we should be aware of?
Okay, so I'm going to start with the second biggest. It's kind of like when you have a contest, and then we'll go to the winner, right? So the second biggest is, we are continuing kind of the traditional path of research in terms of interpretation of the scrolls, but also, and, it's true in every field, in the biblical realm and interpretation and Jewish law and poetry. We're still doing that kind of solid philological literary interpretation, but we are all trying to broaden our scope and see what the connections are with other bodies of literature. You said Jewish Hellenistic literature, early Christianity, rabbinics, and so forth. So we are continuing that work, but we're always trying to broaden our view, okay, and building as big a picture as we want, making connections when we can, but also being very aware of distinctions, okay? So that's like kind of the basic, kind of the core research, the solid state research that's continuing, but also trying to always broaden our scope, broaden our knowledge, sharpen our tools, and so forth. Okay, so the number one thing is, of course, the application of new scientific methods and digital technologies. Okay, so this goes to new, let's say, radiocarbon dating of the scrolls, and that affirms the dating that we did based on the development of the scripts. It includes DNA research on the animal hides that were used, and that also contributes to knowledge of the ancient world, not just to the scrolls, the ink on the scrolls, on the papyrus scrolls, on the leather scrolls, and also digitally. I said 930 scrolls, but we have 15,000 fragments of various sizes. So some of them are large and beautiful, but we have lots that are just parts of words And so now really developing AI techniques to identify possible combinations from this plate and from that plate. Well, physically, they look like they could come together. And if you've got 15,000 fragments, obviously it takes human scholars a lot of time to go through and make those connections. Now, ultimately, I want to say, like everything with AI, I've used AI last year in an exam for my students, right? The decision about whether the artificial intelligence has come up with a proper join, whether physical or whether letters or a good sentence, that decision is going to always have to be made by an expert, a human expert. The AI can bring you all of the possibilities, so it will cut out a lot of time, and it may offer you possibilities that you would not see on your own. And maybe if you lived to 200, you would see them. So it's a tool, it's an important tool, but it does not eliminate the need for experts in the field.
Yeah, that's great. Honestly, I was definitely not thinking that you would say that, but it makes total sense that you would. And that's very exciting that we do have that technology that can cut down on the time. I mean, just like you said, it's a very, very large puzzle for humans. So last thing, you are the director of the Orion Center. Tell us about, just briefly, what is that? How can it be used for the study of the scrolls? If you're interested in the scrolls, what can you do with the Orion Center? Why is it special?
Okay, so I'm going to talk about the website, first of all.
That's what I was thinking.
You were
Because it's
thinking about the
accessible for
website,
everyone.
right? So we have an introduction for beginners on the website. We have a virtual tour of Qumran. I really recommend it, with Jody Magnus, who is the archaeologist of the site of Qumran. We went down on a very, very, very hot day a number of years ago, and we filmed that. And then the next level would be there's bibliography, and there's a bibliography search engine. So if you're interested in a particular topic, whether you are for yourself or you're a student at high school, college level, or you have kids, you can go on and you can search by keyword. If you've read a particular author that you like, you can search by that, or there's a particular scroll you're interested, the war scroll of the Sons of Light against the Sons of Darkness, you can search in the search engine. And also there are announcements about conferences and seminars all over the world. So you're sitting in Atlanta, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so if Emory is putting something on, or if Carol Newsom and Emory is giving a public talk and we find out about it, we will post all of that on our website. And if there's major new publications, it'll be right on the front of the website also. And the last thing I want to mention is we have a whole team of student interns who work on the bibliography project, because we are in charge of the bibliography for Dead Sea Scrolls and associated literature, which means also biblical material, early Christianity, or early rabbinic material, anything that has tangentially related to the scrolls. Every Monday, we post the bibliography that came out the previous week. And so if you're coming to study at Jerusalem, at the School for Overseas Students or the regular program, you can become an Orion intern. Work a few hours at the center, but also it's a learning experience and it goes on your curriculum vitae. And we also have not huge scholarships, but we also do support students, not at the BA level, but sometimes MA, PhD students, to come over for at least a month, some for 3 months, sometimes for a semester. And so that's another opportunity. We have tremendous resources also in our library. Emmanuel Tove, when he finished editing all of the scrolls, finished his project, gave us all of the photographs, for example. And I want to say that even though today we have to use the digital images that the Israeli Antiquities Authority has on their site, they're terrific. They can be manipulated. But over the course of the last 75 years, the scrolls deteriorated. So you could be missing a couple of letters on the edge of a fragment today. The digital material, the digital images aren't going to reproduce that for you. But if you have the photographs that were taken the infrareds that were taken in the 1950s that we have copies of in our office, it's very, very useful. So we have a lot of resources in the center itself. And if you're coming to Jerusalem, you're welcome to come by.
Yeah, that's great.
The website. Yeah, all the information on the web.
I personally have used the bibliography, and I can say, I mean, it's just a comprehensive bibliography, online bibliography data center for all things Dead Sea Scrolls. So if you, like you said, you want to learn about the War Scroll, you should see everything written on it. It's just like extremely useful if this is your cup of tea or if you're doing this kind of research. So that's fantastic. Highly recommend that. We will post a link to that in the show notes as well. And just thank you also for serving as director of the Orion Center, making all that available for as long as you did. It's a tremendous help for all of us that want to take advantage of the tools, but don't want to necessarily do all of the legwork to get a comprehensive bibliography for all of the Dead Sea Scrolls.
Right. Well, I have to say I didn't do all the legwork myself, but setting it up and getting the funding for it. Yeah.
Yeah. Great. So that's all we have time for on this episode of the Biblical Language Podcast. Thank you, Esther, for joining us.
My pleasure.
And thank you to all of our listeners out there who have taken the time to listen to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. We hope you enjoyed the episode.
Thank you for listening to the Biblical Languages Podcast, brought to you by Biblingo. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast app and leave us a review. You can also follow Biblingo on social media to discuss the episode with us and other listeners. And don't forget to visit biblingo.org to start your 10-day free trial of Biblingo.